Still just a morning. And first of all, I'd like to thank Tracy, obviously, for the invitation to speak. My name is Luke, and I'm from York St John University. And for my presentation today, I'm going to talk for around 10 or so minutes, about what athlete burnout is and how the coach could be important. And to start off, I'd like everyone listening, to take a few seconds and consider what comes to mind when you think of burnout for athletes. And for some of you, especially that's not known the literature particularly very well, I imagine you're picturing an athlete that is so dedicated to their sport, they're willing to work tirelessly, they'll make monumental sacrifices, they'll put blood, sweat, and tears into their sport. And as a result, from similar to those images you can see on the screen, the athlete is physically exhausted, because of their intense involvement in that sport. And for the next part, and I wanted to quickly have a think of why athletes are experiencing burnout according to what you kind of know. And when you consider this question, it's possible and even expected maybe that you thought fixture congestion, a long season, or excessive training, and how these can risk athletes of burnout. And if this is the case, it probably comes from the press and the online media and the interviews that high-profile athletes give. As you can see from the quotes on the screen, and therefore, if you take these at face value, it's not surprising that you view burnout and the cause of it in this kind of way. As a result, you align that idea and that view that burnout is simply physical exhaustion. However, burnout isn't simply physical exhaustion, and the media and famous athletes are probably contributing to the misconception, where in fact they are describing risk factors of overtraining syndrome rather than burnout. So if burnout is simply not training too much and being physically tired, what actually is athlete burnout then? So in an attempt to answer this question, I'll try to explain where burnout sits within the literature, and then we're going to define it. So as some of you, or most of you will be aware, there's been an increased interest in the mental health and well-being of athletes. This can be seen through both research and anecdotal evidence. And by bringing mental health and well-being to the topic of conversation, I'm focused on a variety of clinical mental health problems in that research, including depression, generalized anxiety disorder, but a substantial amount of work has also gone into understanding subclinical issues in athletes. And one of those subclinical issues that's received a lot of attention, is athlete burnout. In terms of defining it, it's a psychological syndrome that comprises of 3 symptoms, as we can see on the slide. The first one is reduced sense of accomplishment, which looks at the level to which athletes feel like they're not achieving much in their sport anymore. And then there's sport devaluation, which is the level to which you no longer value or care about your sport. And then finally, there's emotional and physical exhaustion, which considers the level of mental and physical strain that an athlete is experiencing. Unlike almost all psychological variables that we measure, it's using a self-report scale. And in this case, it consists of 15 questions, and hopefully you can see on the right-hand table, on the slide, I provide an example question for each of those symptoms. With athletes that are asked to indicate the level of agreement from 1, which is almost never, to 5, which is almost always. So now that we know what athlete burnout is, why should we care? Why should we take note of this? First of all, athlete burnout symptoms are related to a number of more serious mental health problems and even drop out of sport altogether. And beyond those negative consequences, there are an even greater reason to take note. As a number of colleagues, including with me, I've recently reviewed all studies that have measured athlete burnout since its initial inception of the measure in 1997. And when we did this, we determined that 2 of the symptoms are on the rise, with athletes now experiencing higher levels of reduced accomplishment than ever before, which is on the left graph, and sport devaluation, which is on the right graph. So this is not currently published yet, but hopefully we should be able to have this in the literature in the not so kind of distant future. And based on this in the previous slides, hopefully I've been able to show that athlete burnout is a psychological issue, rather than a physical issue. It has further consequences and it's getting worse. Therefore, we should try and understand what are some of the key factors that are giving rise to the 3 symptoms in order to prevent athletes from experiencing high levels of burnout in the first place. So in terms of those, burnouts receive a lot of attention, in terms of what are those psychological factors that predict it. And one of those is perfectionism, with about 20 or so studies that have sampled the various athletes across ranges, expertise levels, and age groups. And in terms of its definition, as you might have heard earlier from Andy Hill and Dean Watson, according to research, perfectionism reflects kind of two key components. These are excessively high standards and overly critical evaluations of behavior. And according to Hewitt and Flett, they highlight that these standards and critical evaluations can be housed together and can come in three forms. The first is self-oriented perfectionism, which examines how athletes expect themselves to be perfect. The second dimension is socially prescribed perfectionism, which focuses on the level to which athletes think other people expect perfectionism from them. And then the final one is other-orientated perfectionism, when athletes direct their requirement for perfection towards others. So in terms of which form is most linked to burnout, time after time, researchers generally find that socially prescribed perfectionism is the problematic one, where athletes think that other people demand perfectionism from them, and as a result, they are unable to meet the perceived demands placed on them and ultimately experience higher levels of burnout. So in terms of existing research, it has solely focused on athletes' perfectionism and how it can influence their own burnout. Therefore, it's viewed as an individual issue. And as I mentioned earlier, almost all of that research is socially prescribed perfectionism being that kind of problematic dimension and giving rise to athlete burnout. And to extend this work, I conducted a study that set out to examine if the perfectionism of the coach can also have a bearing on athlete burnout. And for this study, I kind of focused on capturing the coach's perfectionism at that kind of perceptual level. Or to put it more plainly, I asked athletes to report how perfectionistic they think their coach is, and tested to see if their coach's perfectionism, or what they thought of their coach's perfectionism was predicted athlete burnout. And based on previous research, I expected that for the athletes themselves, it'd be socially prescribed perfectionism that would be the key dimension. But in the lower box, it was expected that perceived coach other-orientated perfectionism this time would be the important predictor and would be positively related to athlete burnout, whereas the other two forms will be kind of irrelevant. This is because out of those three dimensions, perceived coach other-orientated perfectionism is one that has relevance to others and therefore could provide the opportunity to influence athlete burnout. And for the sake of time, I'll just present the results for total burnout rather than the three symptoms. And from the analysis of 190 athletes competing across a range of individual sports, at step one, of the regression, we wanted to figure out which athlete perfectionism dimensions were predicting their own burnout. And when looking at this, as step one, it was found that athlete perfectionism dimensions together predicted 5% of the variance in athlete burnout, or in their own burnout. And unsurprisingly, it was socially prescribed perfectionism that was the key predictor out of the three dimensions. So to kind of bring that a bit more to life, it seems that those athletes who think that other people demand perfect performance from them are more likely to experience high levels of burnout. And when addressing the main aim of the work and making it go beyond the individual, at step two of the regression, we found that perceived coach other-orientated perfectionism was a significant positive predictor above and beyond athlete perfectionism and predicted an additional 9% of the variance. So this shows that if athletes thought their coach was more outwardly critical and had excessive performance expectations for others, it led the athlete to experience higher levels of burnout. So to finish up, I just want to provide a few key take-home messages. First of all, athlete burnout is more than just physical exhaustion, and instead is a subclinical mental health problem that consists of three psychological symptoms. And when we look into the research over the last 20 years, it seems to be on the rise. And for the research looking into the reasons that influence athlete burnout, it seems that athlete perfectionism, and in particular their socially prescribed perfectionism, can be a consistent vulnerability factor to their own burnout. Therefore, there is a need to help those athletes better manage their perfectionistic tendencies when participating and performing in their sport. And kind of finally, beyond athlete perfectionism, for the first time from a research perspective, athletes may not only experience high levels of burnout because of their own perfectionistic tendencies, but it also comes from the idea and the level to which they think that coach is perfectionistic towards others. Therefore, athletes experience burnout may not solely be that individual issue anymore. And as coaches, while you might not be actually instilling a need for perfect performance in your athletes, how they construe the expectations and criticisms you provide could be psychologically damaging. So before I finish up, for anyone that is interested in this research that I conducted and kind of spoke in the second half of the presentation, it is freely available online. And if Tracy would like, I'll happily put the link up in the chat. And beyond this, I'm still conducting research on this kind of topic area as part of my PhD. Therefore, I'll be more than happy for any coaches to find me an email if they had any thoughts or questions that they wanted answering. So hopefully you found that interesting, and thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Impeccable timing again. What a good group we've got going on here. Thanks very much, Luke. Does anyone have any questions for Luke? Any questions? Yeah, that's a question, Luke. What do you think the one thing that a coach can do to try and help an athlete, protect an athlete from burnout?
Yeah, well, first of all, probably not engaging in hypercritical behaviours and setting excessively high standards, but it's how that coach communicates that information. It might not happen all the time, and it might just be certain influences, like whether it's in competition, just prior to competition, or just after competition. How they communicate to that athlete about how their expectations to perform or their reactions to how that athlete did perform, I think will probably set that precedent for how that athlete believes their coach to be like, and those standards that they feel their coach requires from others and not probably just themselves. So, and also how that coach is working with other athletes. Maybe it's not just that athlete themselves that is the problem. If they're working with someone else and they're probably viewing that person to be excessively high towards their teammate, whatever it might be, it still has an impact possibly on that athlete.
It's a very good point. So basically the behaviors that they model will have a role to play. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, anyone?
Could I ask a question, please, Tracy?
Yeah, Mark.
Thank you. That was great, Luke. I really enjoyed that. I think my experiences of coaching in football, I've coached different age groups, and I would just wonder, has your research or does research indicate any differences between adults and their perceptions of what coaches do or don't do, and I guess teenagers in terms of where they are in terms of their own maturity, in terms of their own their brain development, and in terms of their perceptions of coaches being hypercritical or overly critical? Is there anything in terms of the differential of age group in terms of impacting this type of research?
Yeah, no, it's a super interesting question. My research is all in adult athletes. So obviously we classify adults as anyone just over the age of 18, but most were between that 18 to 25 bracket. And generally across them, they were fine. They were pretty much all the kind of had a similar kind of tendencies, age wasn't a kind of moderating factor. But no, I haven't looked into kind of comparing juniors to more adult athletes. But you might probably see later on, if you attend a talk from Michael, he looks into kind of that area of junior athletes and how the coach might be perceived. And it seems that in both cases, the coach is important. And some of their attributes and their behaviors do seem to play a role. And it would be interesting probably to go explore the idea of either age or expertise level as to kind of what kind of does change, or if anything does kind of change. But no, as far as I'm aware, nothing's kind of been explored in that sense.